All right, guys, I'm joined by my good buddy here. Stuff to talk about. And also, how about this? He's back after a couple of days celebrating his birthday. Just a few days ago. Happy birthday to you, Luke Thomas. You national treasure, international treasure.
Yes. Not a day over 26, right? Not a day over 26.
God damn. Send me your Botox doctor. And by the way, I got to say, man, obviously it's a quiet time in MMA, but I want to quickly get your thoughts on something. Jumping straight into it because you have to go off to the beach with your family soon. Hinata Moicano was on Ariel Helwani's show very recently, and he said some stuff about the settlement, about not wanting to accept it, about how the fighters agreed to a contract, and then they were like, hey, you know, this was unfair. And it sort of spoke to the fact that he didn't want to accept the money because to him it was the equivalent of getting money for nothing or like robbing a bank. The clip went viral. It was on Ariel Helwani's channel, so everyone can check out the full interview. But what was your reaction? I know you would have seen it.
I mean, I listen, if he doesn't want the money, okay. I don't know how wise that is, but it's a free country. It's a little strange if he didn't want the money to why he didn't just opt out, which because you could have done that, right? Rory Markham, I believe, was a fighter I covered. He has a great win over. If you guys have never seen it, one of the low-key best head kick KOs you've probably never seen is Rory Markham over Brody Farber. Incredible head kick KO in the UFC on a fight night card. But Rory Markham, a former Miletich fighter, he pulled out and withdrew from eligibility to receive, settlement money. It's like if you didn't want it, that would have been a great way to do it. But whatever. But the point is, like, listen, if he feels like he doesn't want to take it, I find that to be baffling, but I'm not going to argue with the guy. I think part of what he's saying is there's like two ways that fighters don't, well, many ways, but there's two consistent ways fighters don't really act in accordance to their own interest. And one is they hold a view of economics that is just not really supported by the evidence and is very, very limited, that favors holders of capital over labor. I mean, that's a very sort of euphemistic way to put it, but it really is quite true. And then also, a sort of fear of speaking out. Now, he doesn't have the latter. He just has the sort of the former. And to me, that's somewhat more forgivable, actually. But the reality is very simple. Like, and contract law is well established in this regard in numerous different fields. Like, just because someone signed a contract actually does not mean that you had their full, faith and support, and that the contract wasn't done under onerous terms. Someone could, conceptually, someone could sign a contract for slavery. That doesn't make it, the contract itself. There's a question about like whether they can even ask for that kind of thing, and then also whether you can sign away that kind of thing, even if the two parties mutually agree to it. So, like, finding a view of contract law and contract ethics that centers on, well, the two parties agreed. This is a very, very, very narrow interpretation of the actual much broader ethical and legal dimensions that go into who signs contracts and what for and what actually is justifiable. And lastly, I'd add, the UFC is forced into this settlement because they didn't want to go to trial against a judge who pretty clearly argued and believed that they used monopsony power to suppress wages. That's why this money goes to the fighters. The basic argument is that you were entitled to this, and the nature of how they did business, even if you signed off on the contracts, necessarily made it such that you made less. So it really undercuts the point that he's trying to make, that these two parties agreed. My response would be, so what?
It's fascinating as well. Yeah, just the point where he's like, they signed the contract, They.
I mean, listen, there's something to be said for if you sign a deal, obviously in good faith, you should honor the terms of that, right? Like, if you buy a home, I intend to pay this loan back. And I think a lot of people sort of see it like, well, oh, now you don't want to pay the loan back, right? No, it's not really that. The question is, when you're signing up to give your labor to something on contractual terms, there can be a power imbalance between the entity who is signing you and then you, the signatory, such that you will agree to terms that can often be deeply unfair and in certain cases unethical, and in certain cases even illegal, that has to then be reviewed after the fact. The notion that because you signed it, that this absolves all of these other broader considerations, again, this is an extremely narrow interpretation of things.
Yeah, and speaking of interpretations of things, just while we're talking about deals and contracts, Andy Foster, he was on Ariel Hawani's show as well yesterday, and I found it very interesting. He spoke about couple of rule changes, which I found fascinating, or updates, but they want to put through. But one of the things was he spoke about the updates to the Ali Act. He kind of had a positive view on it, speaking about how it increases the minimum for entry-level boxers and increases some of the things that they would get, which he sees as a positive. Take me through this sort of view on the Ali Act. It seems like there's a lot of sort of officials who are really, really positive on it. Obviously, there's a lot of negatives to it as well. Are there a couple of positive things from these changes that you think are sort of mentionable, or is this just Andy trying to keep the UFC happy and the relationship alive?
I don't think it's one or the other. Or I should say, it's not solely one or the other. It's both. Listen, I've known Andy Foster a long time, and for the duration of that time, I've had a very positive relationship with him, and I have benefited greatly from, to the extent that I understand regulatory processes. Andy Foster has been extremely helpful to me in that regard. I don't want to say that out loud. There's a lot of regulators I've gotten sideways with. Andy Foster was true, right? I mean, you know me, I'm always talking shit about people. So, it backfires over time. But Andy Foster's not been one of those guys. He's not been one of those guys. I've had a very good relationship with him. So if he sees this, I hope he understands that. At the same time, I was a little disappointed in what I heard. Is he right that the establishment of these minimums in states that often don't even have one? Now, California is not like that. California has minimums, of course, but their minimums are already better than what the Ali Act calls for in certain respects. But that makes sense, right? There's so much boxing in California historically. There's so much MMA in California historically. That commission is one of the bigger and busier commissions in the United States. It would make sense that they would have minimums. And Andy, this is again to his credit, has been part of the effort to get retirement savings and funds put towards fighters and boxers, in particular boxers in that state. So again, this is not a guy who, in my judgment, has a very messed up regulatory record. At the same time, to answer the question generally, yeah, those things, the higher insurance coverage, essentially, in terms of the amount that can be covered, and then these minimums per round, these are good things. These are not bad things. These are welcome additions to the regulatory apparatus in boxing. But it's like, if I burned your house down, but I gave you a new bike, would you be like, wow, I'm just not going to notice that your house burned down because this bicycle is really nice? It is a nice bicycle. I got you a Cannondale, right? I went to the bike store. I've spent a couple grand on it maybe, but I just torched your building. Okay. So this is, to me, the way in which I understand this. I just need to be clear with everyone as I possibly can be. It's such a basic question, right? Do you think that MMA is so hard to make money off of that the only people who could have ever done it in the history in a sustained way are 5 white guys in Las Vegas who work in the same office? Is that what you really think? Like, this is so beyond the computational ability of our finest mathematicians and our greatest playwrights and other, deep intellectuals, that they could not figure out the formula? Or is the formula that we kind of know what it is? It's pretty well understood. It's been documented in this UFC lawsuit and others. It's just you have to have the resources to do it, not just the capital, but the actual access to the individual fighters. You have to have that. And if you don't have that, then there's really no game to be played here. People want to keep living in denial that that's exactly what happened to MMA. And now what they're trying to deny is that there's no pernicious effect by porting that over into boxing. I don't know what better advertisement there could be for how important these laws are in boxing, that a monopoly in a sister industry that did not have that regulation won't get into this business until those laws are changed. Guys, what more can I possibly tell you? The Ali Act is flawed, and there's no defense of boxing as a status quo enterprise. But the notion that the solution is to just let a monopoly in a sister industry have designer laws that essentially only they can benefit from is the height of idiocy that you can only be a moron and make that argument in good faith. And I don't believe Andy Foster is in any way, shape, or form a moron.
Well said, Luke. And I think that one of the romantic things to me about boxing is that idea of making it to the top, making the big money. You know, here in Australia, you know, Wednesday night pay-per-views, people are making huge money, you know, and it's just a shame to see all of that change and the game change to that degree if it does go through. Hey, just quickly, I want to quickly get your thoughts on UFC 319 main event. But before I get to that, just very, very quickly, Imavov did an interview with MMA Junkie very recently where he spoke to Farah Farouk, who does an incredible job there. And she asked him about this backup spot that Kaya Bahia has taken for the event. And Imavov explained, the UFC asked us a few weeks ago for me to come to the US for the weigh-ins and everything. I said no, because I have a fight that's scheduled 3 weeks later. So I don't have time to travel and have jet lag. I want to be in the best condition for my fight. That's why I said no. I want to get your take. Kaya Bahia, he is in the spot. Obviously, then he has to fight again very shortly in the main event of UFC Paris. He tells me that this won't be an impact on him, but realistically, is Kaya sort of taking a little bit of a risk here, being the backup for this fight so quickly before this huge main event with a very tough opponent, Imavov, in Paris?
I don't know how much weight he cuts, and that really is going to be a pretty big, you know, that's going to be maybe the most important ingredient in this whole thing. You know, I'll just say this. If I was a manager and I was advising one of my clients who was in a situation, I would advise them to do what Imavov did, right? Where, I mean, his situation is a little bit different. Well, actually, no, it wouldn't. I'm not sure how much of Bohalio's camp takes place in the United States, but the point I'm trying to make is it's a big travel request for Imavov, and you got to cut weight, and then you got to go back. Like, it's insanely disruptive right at the time. Because remember, you don't peak, you peak on fight night, but in terms of like, you know, the camp, you have to ramp up to a certain level. If you now introduce, you know, time change, if you introduce weight cut, if you introduce travel, and who knows if the travel is even smooth, by the way, right? I mean, delays where you're sitting on your hands for long periods of time. This is insanely disruptive right at this kind of peaking moment in, you know, elite prep. Why would you do that? And again, you might be asking, well, what if they make it worth your while? Well, the money is always going to be a determining factor here. Now, to be clear on this, I don't know what the UFC's policy is. What I can tell you is I know for a fact, that I had a UFC fighter tell me who was offered to take a backup fight for a title fight. And it was $20K offer. You know, it was a $20K offer. Oof. So now I don't know. Was that a percentage of their purse? I don't know. Is it a flat? I don't think it's a flat fee. You know what I mean? The point I'm trying to make is maybe they offered him, let's say they offered him 100K, right? Like, you know, 6 figures, not a small amount of change. That's an interesting temptation. But given the risk that you run, I just don't know if that is a trade that you make.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like 100K is better than 20K, but I guess
100K changes. Yeah, 100K. That's when you start to be like, okay, is this something we should actually consider? But if it's not going to be an amount like that, I think then the equation's very different, right?